The deification of America's founding fathers was a slow process. It occurred over time through embellishments and omissions, with generations of schoolchildren learning fictitious stories about cherry trees and wooden teeth until we arrived at the versions of the founding fathers that we know today. In many cases, idealized versions have replaced reality, and we often forget the one thing that many of them had in common. They bought, sold, and owned human beings. They were deeply immersed in the institution of slavery, which consequently is built into the framework of America. The most prominent founding father, George Washington, was a prodigious slaveholder. At one time, he owned over 300 men, women, and children. Washington's accomplishments cannot be diminished, but his role in the institution of slavery cannot and should not be divorced from them. In order to have a productive discussion about slavery and its connection to modern racial inequalities in America, George Washington's culpability must be made apparent. The persecution of Black Americans did not end when slavery did. Their subjugation has persisted, only changing in name and appearance. After the 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as punishment for crime, the criminal justice system was modified to frame Black criminality as a serious and pressing problem. Jim Crow laws, segregation, and the mass incarceration of Black men and women are all post-emancipation forms of Black bondage. Racial hierarchy and the mythology of Black criminality stem from the institution of slavery, which is deeply ingrained in America's collective consciousness and reaffirmed by the veneration of slaveholders such as George Washington. George Washington first became a slaveholder in 1743 at the age of 11, when his father passed away and willed him 10 human souls. His human property increased throughout his lifetime, through purchases at the auction block, and most drastically upon his marriage to Martha Curtis, who brought 84 captive people with her to Mount Vernon. By 1789, George Washington was the largest slave owner in Fairfax County. Nonetheless, George Washington's status as an American icon is faithfully maintained. One of the ways that this is accomplished is by asserting that all elite men owned slaves at the time. Not only is this claim inaccurate, but it serves to normalize slavery and limit slaveholders' culpability. Samuel Adams, John Jay, Thomas Paine, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin are just a few examples of prominent men who emancipated their slaves during their lifetime or did not own slaves at all. For much of his presidency, Washington lived in Philadelphia, a city that was quickly moving away from slavery and towards abolition. During his time there, a state law existed that required the emancipation of any captive person who lived there for a period of 6 months or more. To avoid this law, Washington rotated his slaves back to Mount Vernon within that window of time. He made every attempt to shield his captives from the knowledge of their rights in Pennsylvania, and insisted on the utmost secrecy when executing these plans, knowing that it would be a PR disaster should the public find out. The brutality and immorality of slavery was clearly understood. Suggesting that Washington's conduct regarding slavery was a consequence of the time is incorrect. Also, arguing that slavery was common of elite men frames it as an issue of social class rather than race. While slavery has existed in numerous societies throughout history, American slavery is unique in that one's status as a slave or free person depended entirely on the color of their skin. Denying the principal role that race plays in inequalities is a tactic that continues to be employed today, as amply evidenced by the Black Lives Matter movement. When others disparage the Black Lives Matter movement by claiming all lives matter, they are denying the fact that race plays a prominent role in modern injustices, and forgetting that Black people have yet to be included in the idea of all lives. Washington's role in slavery is also rationalized by claiming that he treated his captives well. Accounts vary on how well Washington treated his slaves, but the constant threats of being sold, separated from one's family, or physically punished were always present. Records show that Washington sold his captives as far away as the West Indies, and he once sold a human being for a quantity of wine. Most captive people owned by Washington lived in detached structures that were hot in the summer and cold in the winter, and they were given only enough food to prevent starvation. Threats of rape and sexual assault were always present, and sickness was a very real issue. And of course, no matter how well Washington treated his captives, the very nature of slavery is a grievous violation of an individual's human rights. Freedom is preferable to enslavement under any circumstances. As his life progressed, Washington privately expressed unease with the institution of slavery, both economically and morally, though he never denounced the system publicly. Washington died at his home in Mount Vernon on December 14, 1799, after a short-lived illness. In his will, he ordered that all of the captive people he owned, which was 124 out of the 277 at Mount Vernon, be emancipated upon his wife's death. The other 153 captive people were dower slaves and belonged to Martha Washington's late husband's estate. This meant that George Washington had no control over their fate. Certainly, freeing the people that he had enslaved was better than the alternative, but it does not erase his participation in the institution of slavery, nor does it negate its lasting effects. Washington profited from the compulsory labor of captive people throughout his entire life, and he ensured that his wife would not suffer from a lack of slave labor after his death. Despite the fact that over 90% of the population at Mount Vernon consisted of captive people at one time, today, representation of slavery at the historic site is incomplete, inaccurate, and at times absent altogether. It is presented in a way that limits Washington's culpability while maintaining his status as an American icon. This leads to half-truths and misrepresentations. Misleading language is also commonplace. Captive people are often referred to as workers, laborers, or servants, which subtly downplays the fact that George Washington owned human beings. In fact, visitors can avoid the topic of slavery altogether if they so choose. Individuals have to seek out a special tour to learn about the enslaved population at Mount Vernon, and employees are generally unable to provide information about slavery beyond the most basic facts. However, steps are being made to remedy this, and archaeologists are at the center of the effort. In 2014, archaeologists began a multi-year project at the slave cemetery located just south of Washington's new tomb. The goals of the project are to delineate the boundaries of the cemetery, identify the number of individuals interred there, and determine the spatial layout. They will not, however, be excavating human remains, out of respect for the people buried there. These efforts are being made in the hopes of providing insight into the lives of the enslaved community that lived on Washington's estate. Moving forward, projects like these can serve as a form of restorative justice by helping to heal past injustices and provide alternative narratives. American children are taught about the Founding Fathers' great accomplishments, but rarely hear the truth about their roles in slavery. We are taught to revere George Washington and the other Founding Fathers, and not to question their status as American icons. If the topic is broached, we are quickly reassured that all elite men owned slaves at the time. Washington treated his captives well, and he emancipated them in his will. These traditional rationalizations are largely inaccurate and inadequate. American slavery was not an event that ended in 1865, but a historical process that manifests today in the mass incarceration of Black men and women and their struggle to be seen as human. We can only understand modern racial inequality and provide restorative justice when the truth about slavery and our Founding Fathers' participation in it is made visible. It is imperative that we become less concerned with propping up a false image of America's Founding Fathers and more invested in the human rights of Black men and women in America today.